Many ancient texts have attempted to depict the beginning of the world. A few examples include the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the Hebrew Bible's Genesis, and Plato's Timaeus. Others, like one of Plato's students, his best known, Aristotle, in his Physics, attempted to argue for the eternal uncreated nature of the world. Many even earlier cultures, oral cultures, engaged in ancient placemaking rituals, not simply in an attempt to describe, but to reenact the creation of the world. For example, the Australian Achilpa tribe. The trunk of a gum tree would be fashioned into a sacred pole, an axis mundi, which the Achilpa would anoint with blood and climb in order to bless and transform wild territories into habitable places, into a home. The Achilpa carried the sacred pole with them as they traveled, allowing them to consecrate new land by establishing a connection between heaven and earth. And if the pole was ever broken, it meant catastrophe. It meant the end of the world and the return of chaos. And we might ask what the modern scientific equivalent of the Achilpa placemaking staff might be. What is the equivalent of the staff stuck into the center of their Aboriginal nomadic campsites? I would suggest that we could point to geometry. The mathesis of points and lines and planes and curves used to describe the modern map of the globe and indeed of the entire universe. Of course, even calculative science, with all its exploits, cannot calculate everything. So what does science make of the incalculable? And the incalculable is not an aberration or is not in any way abnormal. It's quite ordinary. Even perfect circles, for example, are incalculable because of the irrationality of pi. There are infinite curves, there are strange attractors, there are black holes and spiral galaxies, living organisms, all of these things, plainly evident to scientific observation, remain incalculable. So the modern scientific Earth measuring staff, this Cartesian coordinate grid, was intended by Descartes to raise the human animal beyond the playful eros of imagination into the logical heights of disinterested reason. Modern technoscience, armed with analytic geometry, plays the part of conqueror of chaos, imposer of determining laws, discoverer and securer of certain knowledge. Chaos for this Cartesian tradition is coded as threatening, as the unruly unknown that needs to be subdued and controlled. Chaos is even erased. It's replaced by nothing. The nothing out of which the omni-God of Descartes and Newton, the all-powerful deistic creator, created the world by fiat. God creates out of nothing. But what if chaos could be recoded, like Gregory of Nyssa's luminous darkness? An infinite fecundity rather than mere nothingness, a prima materia from out of which all order emerges and is resubmerged. What if creation could be recoded as the poetic interplay of chaos and cosmos, never one or the other reigning supreme, but a continual interplay? There's another creation myth coming out of ancient Greece, Hesiod's Theogony. where we learn first of Gaia and Oranos, or earth and heaven, and we learn that all other happenings, all other gods, are their children. And Hesiod's lesson here seems to be that human beings existing between heaven and earth cannot invent geometry inside their heads ex nihilo, as if we were measuring the earth and the heavens from beyond them, as though we were floating in some invented pseudo-space or some total void. To measure anything, we must first mark out our territory in the dirt and build a hut to block out the stars overhead. Only then can we place such heavy concentration on such airy abstractions. Geometry need not lead to misplaced concreteness, of course. There are many geometries, there are many ways to measure. Such measurement can be useful for world making. But we need to remember that any staff that we plant in the sand is never going to stand the test of time. Staff planting is always a temporary creative gesture. It presumes a before and an after. Every such planting already assumes soil warmed by sunlight that feeds the hand who hammers it. Staff planting, like all creation, is never ex nihilo. So we've just read several chapters from the feminist process theologian Catherine Keller's book, Face of the Deep, subtitled A Theology of Becoming. This book was published in 2003, and in it, along with much of the rest of her work, Keller provides us with a great example of how we might try to weave the living word of a particular tradition into contemporary relevance without getting tied in literalistic knots of monolithic meaning. So she is a Christian theologian, but she's trying to reread and recode the Bible, as we will see. And I've dropped you right into the middle of this densely elusive text of hers. It's not an easy read, particularly if you're unfamiliar with Derrida and Deleuze. But I think there's still something for everyone in this text if you can struggle through it. And I think being dropped into the middle of it like this might even be appropriate given the theme of this text, which is the fact that creation of any kind, divine or creaturely, always takes place in media res, right? In the messy middle, where we never have full knowledge or ultimate control over the outcome. So whether or not this sort of existence in the middle of things is true of the Godhead or of the Absolute, it is undeniably our condition as finite human beings, as process philosophers or process theologians. As Whitehead put it, our condition, in one of his essays on relativity theory, he said, fragmentary individual experiences are all that we know. And so when we engage in speculation, he says we must start from these disjecta membra as our sole datum, as our sole data. He says it is not true that we are directly aware of a smooth running world, which in our speculations we are to conceive as given. Right? So he's saying the world is fragmentary. We encounter it as a problem, as a whole nest of problems. And we don't have the completed view that might give us the immediate answer to all of the problems we might encounter and the questions we might ask about them. And so when we engage in speculative philosophy, when we engage in theology, we can't claim to have that kind of God's eye view, right? He's trying to put us in the middle of things, just like Keller is trying to put all theorizing, whether theological or scientific, within the world. And even as we'll see, she wants to put God within the world and the world within God. So she's offering us a kind of panentheism. And she's inspired by Whitehead here in his view of what it is to do speculative philosophy or speculative theology, or perhaps even speculative theosophy, to replace the masculine logos with the feminine Sophia. So Whitehead says, this is the final part of this quote, he says, "In my view, the creation of the world is the first unconscious act of speculative thought. And the first task of a self-conscious philosophy is to explain how it has been done." So this is from one of Whitehead's essays written in 1915, I believe, called Space, Time, and Relativity, and it was published in his book Aims of Education. So the first unconscious act of speculative thought is the creation of the world, and Whitehead's saying philosophy's task is to become conscious of how this has been done. And so he's really saying here, if this first creative act was God's act, that the work of philosophy is a kind of theurgical work, that we are, in a sense, participants in the divine nature ourselves, trying to remember how we did it. So Keller's book then is a meditation on the first few verses of Genesis, in the first book of the Hebrew Bible. Specifically, she's meditating on the meaning of the phrase in Hebrew, tohu vabohu, which occurs in the second verse of Genesis. Now, Keller disputes long-established interpretations of these verses by some church fathers, who claimed that they depicted an omnipotent God's free creation of the universe from absolutely nothing, creatio ex nihilo. But Keller argues there's actually no or very little biblical basis for this ex nihilo doctrine. She tries to show that Genesis, in fact, describes a far messier, polytonal, and co-creative event. She calls it creatio cooperationis, creation by committee, by co-creative invitation, rather than mono-domination. Keller herself invites us to reimagine biblical theology free of patriarchal overcodings, drawing on the mysticism of negative theology and the science of chaos theory. So the first verses of Genesis are usually translated like this: "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." Keller cites the 11th century French Jewish grammarian Rashi, whose translation of Bereshit preserves its literal meaning as written without an article, not, in other words, not in the beginning, but in beginning, implying that God's beginning is not an absolute start, but a beginning again. Here, Keller draws on Stengers and Ilya Prigogine, who were inspired by Whitehead and did much research together in chemistry that helped lead eventually to Prigogine's Nobel Prize. They worked on far from thermodynamic equilibrium systems. And in their book, Order Out of Chaos, they point out that if we're going to do theology, we have to recognize that God's creation may have required multiple attempts. And then Prigogine and Stengers quote the French Jewish philosopher André Neher, who writes that 26 attempts, he speculates, preceded the present Genesis, all of which were destined to fail. Neher continues, "The human world has arisen out of the chaotic heart of the preceding debris." "Let's hope it works," exclaimed God as he created the world. So Nair here and Stengers and Prigogine drawing on him are suggesting that, creation can only take place from a preceding debris, even God's creation. And, Keller here is emphasizing that any human hope we have in the world working out is a reflection of God's limited power and the radical uncertainty of our shared history of co-creation with God. So it's the process vision of creation and of the divine is one wherein God lacks omnipotence, right? God is not the sort of creator who might contend force for force with the beings of the world. Whatever sense we might make of the idea of divine creation has to forego this idea of a domineering deity, right, who reaches in from beyond to overpower finite creatures. So creativity for Whitehead, as he explains in the final chapter of Process and Reality, in some ways transcends God. Creativity is that ultimate relation through which God and world co-create one another, right? He says it's just as true that the world creates God as to say that God creates the world. So this is a big ask for traditional religious believers, for traditional theologians, to say, look, we can't have an omnipotent God. An omnipotent God, in fact, is unbelievable, too incredible, particularly because of the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful, why should there be any evil? Why could not an all-powerful God have rid the world of evil? Process theology, God can't prevent evil. Evil becomes more of a byproduct of a cosmogenesis, of the idea of creation as always ongoing, always unfinished. Evil is a sort of symptom of the fact that there is an evolution occurring. Something new is always being born, meaning something is always dying. And God is as caught up in that process of life and death and birth as any creature. So if we return now to Keller's references to Rashi and his translation of Genesis, she notes that Rashi also preserves the plural noun Elohim, which is usually translated by nervous monotheists into the singular, into just God. We'll return to that. Rashi also has this hermeneutical care that leads him to suggest that the first verse is not really a complete sentence, it's a dependent clause. And so the second verse then becomes a parenthetic clause, and the third verse, the independent clause. So then the first three verses, read in Rashi's way with this real attention to grammatical detail, should read this. When Elohim began to create heaven and earth, at which time the earth was tohu vabohu, darkness was on the face of the deep, and the ruach was moving upon the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." So some words here are left in the original Hebrew, right? But Rashi is rereading this to lessen the sense of an omni-God who is creating by fiat, and to bring forth a more plural sense of Godhead as what Keller would call many-one, as a plurisingularity, and helping us shift the semantics away from any sense of creation from mere nothing. There was something already with God in the beginning, out of which God created, or into which and through which God created. So when speaking of angels, if we still want to do so, we can follow Keller in drawing upon the rich tradition of hermeneutical heretics, in addition to Rashi, who turn to angelology in order to refute ex nihilo creation theories. So to return to this word Elohim, right? Keller dwells rhapsodically on this use of the plural to refer to God. Elohim is plural for Eloah, which is not a personal name like Yahweh. It can be used to describe any deity, right? Eloah. And Elohim would mean deities. But the plural noun here in the Genesis context is accompanied by a singular verb, bara, meaning create. Elohim creates. Some interpreters, like the 11th century Spanish-born poet Abraham ibn Ezra, have claimed that Elohim refers to God's angels. Keller's Whiteheadian understanding of God as a persuader rather than a commander really shines through when she writes regarding the implications of this angelic, Elohimic plurisingularity, and I quote her, "Crowding and complicating the hermeneutical time-space, the turbulent swarm of godhood has always transgressed any possible boundaries between the one original creator and the many derivative creatures. According to this imaginary of bottomless process, the divine decision is made not for us, but with and through us. Amidst the chaosmic committee work of creation, what work remains for a creator to do, aside from its decisive delegations, quote, let the earth bring forth, etc.? Can we say with process theology that the creator emits an eros to which every creature willy-nilly responds? Some respond more responsibly than others to the cosmic desire. Committees and democracies make a lot of messes. Our responses generate our own plurisingular intersubjectivities out of the multiples of elemental energies, codes, socialities, ecologies that at any moment constellate our cosmoi. Elohim arises out of those unruly depths over which language catches its breath. The creator, in creating, becomes in singular plurality. So Keller here is exemplifying theopoetry for us, and she's describing, the way that this sort of creation by committee does make a lot of messes, right? As I was saying, the theodicy implicit in a process theology requires accepting that God's power is, if God does have power, it's a relational power. It's the power to be affected just as much as the power to affect. And so God has a passive pole and is not pure act, as the dogmatic tradition of Christendom has so long assumed. There's also this passive side. This is what Whitehead means by the consequent nature of God. And so God becomes with us. God is a fellow sufferer, as Whitehead puts it. So Keller is a very skilled hermeneut, capable of holding her breath long enough to dive into the polysemic depths of scriptural meaning and of surfacing to tell the story of her journey without superficially collapsing it into a monotone theology or exploding it into relativistic jelly. She carefully unwinds the palimpsestic threads woven into the poetic phrase that begins the biblical book of Genesis, tohu vabohu, and she discovers there evidence of a goddess's murder. The Hebrew poet who wrote Genesis was clearly influenced by the Babylonian Enuma Elish, which depicts the warrior god Marduk's slaughter of Tiamat. This term Tiamat is related to the Semitic word tehom, meaning abyss. The traditional interpretation of the phrase, under the monotheistic pretense of demythologization, denies all agency to the tehom. The ex nihilo doctrine requires that that God be alone in the beginning, the sole creator of everything, even that out of which creation is shaped. Keller reads into tohu vabohu and uncovers its pre-patriarchal significance, enfolded just beneath the surface. Rather than traditional commentators who point to the monotony, God said, God said, God said, of the creation narrative as evidence of its utter transcendence over any other merely mythic event, Keller focuses on what she calls the flirtatiously alliterative wordplay of these same verses. As Nietzsche referred to it, the monotonotheism of the ex nihilo tradition is replaced in Keller's reading with the participatory eroticism of Elohim's creative persuasiveness. Genesis reads, "Let the earth produce," the Hebrew tadse. "Let the earth produce vegetation," the Hebrew dese, tadse dese, in chapter 1, verse 11. Then let the waters produce, yizresu, sea creatures, seres, in chapter 1, verse 20. Tohu vabohu is read by Keller with the shining wake of its animistic origins intact, such that the pre-creation elements are read not as formless and void, but as active participants, responsive to God's angelic call to cosmos, to order. In effect, Elohim had to ask permission before creating. The God poet, no matter how genius, always sings with a chorus, remaining forever placed in the chora, as Plato referred to it, always located in cosmic imagination or chaosmic imagination. No creative act is ever from nothing. So Keller's process-inspired theopoetry is an attempt to replace dominant readings of the Bible, marred by what she calls the light supremacism of its patriarchal context, to resuscitate a more chthonic, relational reading, patient enough to let its eyes adjust to the luminous darkness, courageous enough to let love outshine the lust for power and control over what we do not understand, even and especially in the face of evil. In our secular age, theology of the traditional sort may be impossible, incredible, but theology of some sort remains indispensable, I would say, lest we default to the God of the market or worship of the nation or some other secular replacement for religion. Keller is thus seeking to recycle Christianity from the debris of Western history. Theology, without denying its scientific aim, must also become poetic, and she's attempting to exemplify this transformation of theology. The 7 days of creation, she suggests, can be reread not as the imposition of order from above, but as a fractal cascade of multi-tiered indeterminacy, lured by the strange attractions of a God-become trickster mom. This is her reading of creation not as a big bang, but as a big birth. It's a reading of God who, or whom, by feeling and so being felt, invites the becoming of the other. And by feeling the becoming of the other, the divine itself becomes. This is a vision, a reading of God, not just as being, but as becoming. Keller is attempting to recover rather than reinvent meaning from nothing, right? This is her process theological wager. I think meaning-making endeavors of one kind or another are crucial for anthropoesis, for humanity's ongoing creation of itself and our ongoing political struggle to compose a more inclusive cosmos, to create a more inclusive world, a collective dissipative structure that structures all of our diverse becomings. some way of managing the materiality of our situation, right? As beings, becomings on the earth, beneath sun and moon and other stars. There's an infinity above, there's an entropy below, and we need meaning to help us navigate this type of situation. And I hope that following Keller, you'll see the opportunity here, not merely to dress theology, Christian theology in drag, but rather simply to queer its to homophobic roots, allowing the tradition to bring forth blossoms of an earthier hue.